The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. The Passion of the Lord.
There is a lot here. And I want to resist the temptation to not give it all its due by addressing all of it today, because today is Palm Sunday and we recount the story of the whole week. But we'll also gather here at Love of God on Thursday evening for Maundy Thursday, which looks at, among other things, the institution of the Eucharist, which we heard about in this reading. We'll gather on Good Friday, and I think that's the appropriate time, homiletically at least, to look at the crucifixion, and then gather on Saturday at 8 p.m. for the Great Vigil of Easter and our one-year anniversary in this space. So let me talk briefly about the entry into Jerusalem and the stuff you don't know. As many of us are aware, perhaps even all of us, this time that these events took place was during the Jewish feast of Passover. And the cultural background is that the Romans had occupied Israel some years before, actually around 60 years before Jesus was even born, if memory serves me correctly. And at the Passover, because they were the military conquerors and occupiers, they thought it was necessary to put on a show. And so what would happen is Herod would go outside the city, and he'd take all his chariots and all his military people, and he'd take this triumphant entry into Jerusalem. Yes, dear. You want to come with? You want to come? We can tell about Palm Sunday with you, because kids get to preach too and pray. And so, at the same time that Herod was making his entry on one end of the city, this show of temporal power and authority and might, Jesus was entering the other side of the city in what we now think of as the Palm Sunday procession. And when you understand that, you start to see these pretty stark contrasts. Here on the one hand is Herod, all temporal power and might and weapons and chariots, sort of like the old parades we used to see when the Eastern Bloc countries were still the Eastern Bloc countries, when the tanks would roll down the street and the parades would have missiles on them. And it was the biblical equivalent of that. And on the other hand, here is Jesus riding on the back of a donkey. And garments are strewn before him, and they declare, here comes the real king. And it's part of that overall message of Jesus, which shows a tremendous contrast of images. Shows how what appears to be power isn't really power on the other end. And what appears to be weakness is really lasting power. And so he comes into the city in this procession, and then tomorrow, Monday and Holy Week, he goes into the temple and cleanses it. It's the famous line that is so often misunderstood, the famous story rather, about Jesus making a whip out of cords that he braids together and drives out the money changers. And we often think that Jesus had some problem with the fact that the people there were selling things. And in fact, that wasn't the case at all, because there were, at the major Jewish festivals, every good Jewish person went to Jerusalem, and they presented a sacrifice. And rather than, suppose that Wisconsin is Israel. Well, rather than, if you lived in Green Bay, dragging your firstborn lamb all the way down to Milwaukee to sacrifice it, you could go to the temple and buy a lamb to sacrifice, or if you couldn't afford a lamb, you could buy 2 pigeons, turtle doves, but pigeons. And that was all well and good, but there had developed this culture that said, well, you have pretty good stuff, but it's not really perfect. And so even if you live close by, you really ought to buy our stuff at the temple, because your stuff may be choice meat, but ours is prime cut. And so what happened was people were getting cheated, and the price and the cost were going up and up. And it was probably that taking advantage of the poor that Jesus objected to more than the fact that they were transacting these commercial transactions, because the temple is the Temple Mount is about 3 football fields wide and 5 football fields long. And the actual Holy of Holies occupied only a small part of one end of it. And so where this was going on was in the court of the Gentiles. And the court of the Gentiles, much like its name implied, is where the Gentiles could go within the temple. They were awfully far from the Holy of Holies, but they were still up on the Temple Mount, and it was considered, because the Gentiles were there, not the cleanest of places. And so it wasn't the buying and the selling. It was the disparity. It was the economic taking advantage of people. And as a part of this whole process, you can look at Jesus and say he was anti-culture, as much of our conservative brethren and sistren do. Or you can understand that what he was opposed to the advantage that the religious authorities of his day were taking of the common people. And so that's a very different thing. Did I offend you? Okay, I'm sorry I offended you. No, this is fine. And so what he objected to were the religious authorities of his day taking advantage of the people. We've somehow twisted that contemporarily and said that we need to be at war against the culture, because we've pasteurized and homogenized Jesus and turned him into that. And in fact, Jesus wasn't at war against the culture at all. Jesus was at war on behalf of the culture. He was standing up to the religious authorities of his day, not really the civil authorities, although there was a connection, and saying, you're treating people poorly. And I think that's really the central message of Palm Sunday and even Monday and Holy Week, is that we have to correct this impression that we have that there's something wrong with human culture. Because while it's not perfect, inherently it isn't evil either. And we have to correct this mission that people are on to battle the culture and reform the culture and convert the culture and establish a theocracy where they see, particularly conservative folks, see themselves then as controlling the government and making the culture right, because that's precisely what the Pharisees were doing. In fact, the high priest was in cahoots with Herod and the Roman occupiers. The high priests were involved with this civil battle against culture and against people. And somehow we've fallen into that place again. So if we carry a message out on Palm Sunday, it must be that culture is good and that people are good. And it's those systems and those authorities that would lock people into a closet or push them down and oppress them that is really the problem and really the message of Palm Sunday. We need to stand up for those that the powers that be would hold down, and we need to free them, not oppress them even more.